Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Lovely to see you here. Going to give you a few minutes to come in from the waiting room. We've got a good number of you just getting settled, connecting up to audio and visual. Really lovely to have you here at our Health Anchors Learning Network event on net zero and procurement. We're expecting quite a few people to make their way in over the next couple of minutes. So I'll just get us set up and talk through some of the housekeeping as everyone's arriving. As I said, really lovely to have you all here. I'm Julia Slay. I'm one of the senior associates at the Innovation Unit, and I work on the Health Anchors Learning Network, doing a lot of the facilitation of our learning sets, and really excited that we're focusing in on this issue today, net zero and procurement, two of the big anchor levers and objectives coming together. We've got an awful lot of you coming in today, which is fantastic, and we're going to get started in a moment. Please do introduce yourself in the chat, say hi, let us know where you're from, what your role is. From what we've seen of the attendee list, there's a really wonderful mix of people from procurement and from sustainability backgrounds. A lot from the NHS, also a fair number coming from local authorities. We're running this as a Zoom meeting rather than webinar because we've got some really interesting interactive components coming up. So that just means you'll have to be careful to keep your mute button on when you're kind of coming into the space, and we may take the liberty to mute you if you've accidentally come off mute. We are going to have opportunities for you to contribute later on in the session. I'll say more about that in a moment. But yeah, as I said, those of you just joining us and coming in from the waiting room, please do say hi, introduce yourself in the chat. And you'll see there, we've also got socials on the bottom left-hand side. You can join the discussion online, share your thoughts and reflections using the hashtag Health Anchors. We also are going to be recording today's session and sharing that on YouTube. The slides from the presenters are going to be shared, so you don't need to worry about that. Those will be coming out to you. They'll be emailed out after the session. We would love you to be sharing your examples, reflections, and practice as we go through the session. There's some brilliant there's a brilliant range of people joining today from all across the UK and representing procurement teams, supply chain managers, sustainability leads, net zero leads, people working in public health, in learning, data, innovation. And we really want to make sure that you have the benefit from each other's experience as well as from our two fantastic speakers. So we're going to be giving you opportunities throughout to contribute and share what you've tried and tested and learned, but just, you know, use that chat, really make it as much of it as you want to. Great to see some of your examples coming through there. And those of you, I think we're up to about 61 of you now. We're expecting maybe a small handful more. So if you've just joined, I'm Julia, we're just getting started. We are going to be starting with our first speaker in just a moment. Please do introduce yourself in the chat. We've got all the info on socials there. And Kelly, if we could move to the next slide, that would be fab. So as you know, what the conversation is focusing on today is on how procurement and supply chain activities can help meet the big net zero targets that many of you are working towards. And we've got two brilliant speakers, as well as quite a lot of opportunity for you all to contribute as well. We've got Kristina Jackson, who's the Sustainable Supply Chain Manager at the City of London Corporation. So really interesting local perspective from one of the London boroughs. And then we've also got Alex Hammond, Head of Sustainable Procurement and Supply Chain at NHS England. So a bit more of a kind of NHS national perspective. Both of those have been doing some really brilliant work and have got some great resources, learning and insights to share today. And I'm so excited we've managed to get them here. There's also lots of you here who've been part of our events before and part of the learning sets. And as you know, we want you to contribute and share your learning too. So use the chat as we go throughout. Please feel free to ask questions either to the speakers or to each other. And yeah, if you've got relevant experience you want to share, please do. We've got a Slido coming up partway through, which will be an opportunity to add some of your reflections to a couple of specific questions, but don't feel that you have to wait for that. And I've seen in the chat, a few of you are struggling with audio. I think one of the things we recommend as a first step is to try and leave and then rejoin. And then, yeah, you can also test it. So there's a little arrow by the mute button and you can test your audio there. Hopefully that will solve it for most of you. Fab. I think, and as those of you who've just joined, you will see probably that we're recording the session, and we will be sharing that on our YouTube, as well as sending out the slides to everyone afterwards. So without further ado, well, let's go on actually just one more slide before I introduce Kristina and her presentation. If we could move to the next slide, please, Kelly, thank you. Why this event and why now? As many of you will know who've been to Hammond events before, we take a kind of thematic approach, and we've explored lots of different themes in the past. We have had sessions before looking at sustainability. We haven't yet looked at this intersection of procurement, supply chains, and sustainability. And we run a number of learning sets where people come together from anchor organizations across the UK to share their experience in learning. And in those learning sets, we've been hearing some really interesting examples of both the challenges people are facing and also some of the opportunities and ideas they're coming up with. So we've heard people talking about how they feel they can go even further on their sustainability ambitions by working differently with suppliers. They're trying and innovating in this space, and they are really kind of curious to learn from and hear from others. So we're really interested and excited to have your contributions today, in particular, because we suspect there's quite a lot of great practice happening in different pockets across the UK. And many of those examples and innovations are kind of gathering really interesting data. So people are doing, for example, audits of some of their existing suppliers just to try and understand what people have already got in place, try and think about how they prioritize their resource and their engagement. Oh, and you might need to go on mute if you've come off mute. We're running this as a meeting or webinar today, and so yes, there'll be quite a few of you able to come in, and we're hoping to bring in some contributions later. So we're really excited about hearing today from these two different perspectives, the kind of procurement and supply chain teams who are busy working with suppliers, changing their paperwork, their processes, their ways of embedding sustainability objectives and social value objectives, and the people who are often leading the development of sustainability strategies and net zero plans, and who are increasingly working together to think about the intersection of those two pieces. So yeah, just really excited to hear how the conversation goes today. A format is going to be, we're going to hear from Kristina first, about 10 minutes from what's been going on in her work in the City of London. Then we'll do a little bit of Slido, so that will be an opportunity for you to contribute some of your experience, learning, questions, practice. And then we're going to hear from Alex, and then we're going to do a bit of Q&A. So there'll be plenty of time to kind of probe a bit further, hear more from the speakers, and hopefully hear a bit more from each other as well. So Kristina, I might invite you to come off mute and come in now. Welcome, Kristina. Really lovely to have you here.
Thank you.
And I will give you a little nudge when you're at about 8 minutes. So you know you've got a couple more minutes to canter through anything else you haven't covered. But I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself and enjoy.
Thank you, Julia. Yes, so as mentioned, I'm Kristina. I work at the City of London Corporation and have been there for a couple of years now. And I'll be talking you through what I've been doing with our supply chain. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. So I thought I would break it down into kind of two separate areas, looking at what we're doing internal within the organization and also what we're doing external within our supply chain. But just before that, just to give a bit of context, the city has a climate action strategy, which actually covers 14 different themes, which kind of reflect the greenhouse gas protocol. We're meant to be getting to net zero within our own operations, so scope 1 and 2 by 2027, and then within our full value chain by 2040. And that's where the purchase goods and services work stream that I look after sits. We also have broken out construction and purchase goods and services. So at the moment, I just look at purchase goods and services, not construction. That's picked up slightly elsewhere in like the REBA process and through policy and procedure. So within purchase goods and services, we have our facilities suppliers, highways, maintenance, catering, security, things like that. And I've also just put on the screen there for you our four kind of KPIs that we're working to and kind of the progress of where we are at the moment. My slide around external will kind of primarily focus on how we're trying to prove or reduce our annual carbon footprinting, because at the moment it does very much fluctuate with spend. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So internal, so this is like looking within our own organization. Some of the things that we've done recently is change the weighting that we ask for within tenders. So it used to be 10% of the quality section, and now it's 15% of overall. This is for what we call responsible procurement, so social value, ESG, all those sorts of words, and it has to be 15% overall. And this is just helping to really elevate the conversation internally. It means that people don't just kind of throw in a question just because they had to, but they have to kind of think more about it now, because it's taking up more of their weighting, and potentially getting them to think about it in a more operational term as well. So how could they use this question to, you know, ask an operational bit, but also thinking about sustainability and social value. It also is helping to give suppliers a much greater indication that this area is important to us, as it could, in theory, help them win or lose a tender, as 15% is relatively significant. We're also, so under responsible procurement, we have the 6 themes, of which the climate action is the first one. We're also trying to get the conversation more mainstream and make it easier for our officers to talk about this subject. So we've got some standard wording now that goes into all of the tenders, again, just to try a bit more of a catch-all. So instead of us having to always think about something or try and tailor it to each project, we've got some kind of default backup there, which is going into extensions and new contracts as well, again, to make sure that suppliers have a way for them to know that this area is important for us, and for us to have a reason to talk to them and have them, it's an indication to actually respond back to us. On the right of the page, I've kind of outlined what we're doing, or we go through internally to get signed off, but then how it responds externally. So really, last year it was all around kind of knowledge finding, like where are the suppliers at? Have any of them got targets? Have any of them started recording and measuring their footprint? If so, does it differ between small companies? Does it differ between large companies? Does it matter where they're based? And we actually found that was really insightful, because a lot of, I mean, it was a non-scored question, so they had no obligation to answer it, but actually the majority did respond, and the majority had something positive to say. So that allowed us to kind of go on to the next stage, where we're asking like exactly what they're measuring, because, you know, there's a gap between scope 1 and 2 versus 3, and then how much of 3. So we're kind of working through that at the moment. We've also really tried to strengthen the commitment with the supply chain, so asking them like, what one thing are they going to do for us? And we really wanted to do that because previously, when we've been asking like the questions around sustainability, it's been quite hard to confirm exactly what we'd get from it. Like, they write a beautiful response around all things sustainability, but how does that kind of tie back to us? Like, what can our officers and contract managers actually ask for from that? To be fair, we've only asked it twice so far and got responses back, because we haven't had that many to go out at the threshold shown on the page. It's been not quite as successful as we'd hoped. There's a lot of responses about moving to EV, but at least it's a start. Interestingly, most people are actually they're saying more than one thing. So they're going a bit beyond, but just not giving us that measurable piece that we're after at this stage. And then next year, we're going to be tweaking it again to make it more of a commitment for people to work with us and provide us with data. And also they can then go beyond just the one thing. But again, we just want people to get kind of quantifiable with us, so we can start saying, well, you promised us this, where is it? Rather than, you said you're going to follow the waste hierarchy, how does that kind of link to this? The other thing we're doing is engagement with our stakeholders. So I don't know if other authorities have it, but we have these things called category boards, where we get an opportunity to speak to all of the different contract leads who are going out for procurement. And again, flagging and asking them like, what responsible procurement and climate action are they putting into their contracts? What have they thought about? And really trying to get people to think about how it impacts their end user as well. So we get quite often, particularly within like the social value space, of, oh, do we need to put this in because the whole contract is around social value? And we always respond as yes, because there's things that they could be doing within that social value to bring even more. So for the homelessness contracts, like, those users of the service are potentially the more vulnerable to extreme weather events and climate change. So how are they kind of responding or educating the people on the streets to hotter summers or wetter winters and things like that? So trying to really enhance the education at all levels and across the services. The last thing we've done internally is we've almost finished pulling together a low carbon procurement guidance document. So this is a very interactive and clickable document that we hope to eventually share on our internet. so that people kind of it brings all the different terminology together in hopefully an easy to digest way. But because it's quite clickable, it should be, or we're hoping anyway, that people will spend more time going to the bits that they need or the bits that are interested to them. So instead of having to read like a 30-page Word document, they can just jump to the bit that talks about specification or jumps to the bit around how sustainability and cost have a relationship. So it's not always more expensive if you just think about it slightly further up the chain. So this will go live in the next month or so, and the initial response has been positive, but we'll see how many people do read through. But the aim is that they don't have to read the document unless they really want to, but the information will be there for them to understand, you know, what does recycled content mean? What does modular mean? Why should they be thinking about it at all? So we're hoping that will kind of help increase the kind of climate literacy of the organization. If you could move on, please. So the next stage is talking to our supply chain. So at the moment, we've kind of categorized, we've selected 25 suppliers that we're working with more closely. Those 25 were initially selected based off how much carbon they were producing, which was worked out by the spend-based proxy method. We did do some cleansing of it. We wanted suppliers that we would have some form of leverage with. So with the best will in the world, like our BT, for example, big company, in theory, produces carbon because we spend a lot of money with them, but the leverage we would have with them is very small. So it didn't seem worth kind of engaging in that conversation when we could have a much more impactful conversation with maybe a slightly smaller supplier. We've also picked it out to have a variety of sizes of suppliers. So we've got SMEs who haven't even thought about carbon being on their journey, and very large organizations that already have their own tool. We've also got a cross section of different suppliers from the different industries. So we've got ones from the police force, ones for social care, ones from maintenance, so that again, as we go through this, whatever we do, we've got somebody we can kind of sense check what we're doing with to make sure that we're not disadvantaging anybody in the future, because we are very aware that we don't want to keep like asking more and more of our suppliers going forward.
Couple of minutes left, Kristina.
Oh dear, I thought I was doing quite slowly. So we've asked the question and we're engaging with these people. And as of like this morning, we've got 15 suppliers who are on the platform called Avani. So we've worked with a company called Avani, who are a carbon reporting tool, and they're going to hopefully help us move away from this proxy standpoint. They're doing that by initially sending out a survey or a questionnaire to our suppliers, asking them what their own organizational emissions are. Once they've submitted that, we should then be able to tie ourselves to their organizational emissions rather than the spend-based proxy emissions, which we think will save us around 10% of our current reported carbon footprint without doing anything other than asking for better data. Once we have that data, we'll start moving away from that kind of top-down approach of the organization, but more of a bottom-up approach of getting specific information that links directly to the contract. So how much food is someone buying on our behalf? How many miles are the contractors doing in vehicles that are specifically linked to the contract? And kind of starting to build that very much a partnership and collaborative approach to start spotting opportunity, using that information to learn for future contracts and other contracts, but also driving down our own carbon emissions, where we want to get to. So we're hoping for financial year 22-23, we won't be 100% proxy anymore. We'll probably still be like 90 plus, but you know, got to start somewhere. We have actually had quite a lot of positive responses to.
Oh, Kristina, I think your Wi-Fi is going a little bit. We just lost you for a moment. I think we've got you back, but
Okay.
it's showing up as red on your signal. Keep going. It might be my end. Keep
Well,
going.
Julia, I think it might be your end.
My end or Julia's? I'll just continue and hope for the best. So we're hoping to go through that journey. Everyone's been relatively responsive so far. It is free for our suppliers to use. So the SMEs who haven't got on the journey, they're getting a lot of hand-holding and support, which will help them for other bids. Those who have a lot of information, but it's all on Excel spreadsheet, it will help because it will be now nicely in one central place that has snazzy graphs. So again, will hopefully help for the future. Also should shout out that we have Heart of the City as part of our climate action strategy. So any SME that works for the city will get a free place to, again, help them understand this language and landscape. If you're not part of the city, then you can still access their resources. So really good for any other business, large or small, to just look at the website. If you go on to the next slide, which is my last slide. So hopefully I have like 30 seconds to talk through that. These are just our learnings so far. So basically, looking at supply chain, if you just look at spend, so proxy, whoever you spend money with will be at the top, and it doesn't really count for any sort of changes or positive things you do. So you can't tell anybody the great work that you're doing. Pretty much all suppliers we've spoken to have had something to say. Different people obviously have different interests and willingness to go on the journey, but pretty much everyone is aware of the topic. So that's been really positive. And Avani has also gone down quite well so far. And that is where I can leave it in order to keep to time.
Thank you, Kristina. Thank you so much. That was really, really crisp and brilliant learning in there. It's so fantastic to hear about some of the approaches you've been using. There's a couple of questions in the chat, one on how you've been approaching contract management, any resources you've been identifying as needed. So I might invite you to head into the chat and share your thoughts on that while we invite the rest of the audience, and welcome to those of you who've just joined. We are recording this and we're going to share the slides out afterwards, so you will definitely get them. And we've just been hearing from Kristina in the City of London on some of their work with suppliers. But we want to hear about all of your practice. We know that there's a huge number of you attending who are doing probably some really exciting and interesting work locally. And we want to kind of hear a little bit about how you're finding this journey and what work you're doing. So this is very fancy. You can point your phone at the screen if you have a smartphone on you, and take your camera out and scan that QR code, and that will take you straight to the first question we want to explore with you. Or if you're on a web browser, you can join at www.slido.com, and there's the hashtag number to enter. And that QR code is going to stay up on the next slide. So if we flick, it's moved now to the top left-hand side of the screen in case you didn't manage to get it in time. So you can still access it there. And as you can see in the chat from Sav, if you're on a computer, you can go to Slido and add the number in. What we want to ask you first is, when it comes to adapting your procurement processes and influencing the suppliers that you're working with to achieve sustainability goals, what activities have you tried so far? So what is the kind of activity, initiative, anything you've been testing or trying out in your local areas? We would love to hear about it. And if you can, when you log in, use your name, because we may want to invite some of you in to say a bit more about it later. So I can see some of you typing. We'll keep this up for a good few minutes to enable you to come in. And if for any reason you are struggling with Slido, you can pop your reflections in the chat. So we've got a few people here talking about education and signposting to support, doing some pilots, testing things out with smaller numbers of suppliers initially, doing that data analysis piece to identify some of the highest carbon suppliers, developing training and support packages for suppliers so they can self-service with some of the goals, doing the refinement of questions. Great. So the kind of adaptation of some of the tender documentation is coming through. And signposting to e-learning, so there's the kind of capacity building piece, there's the paperwork tender piece. Brilliant, keep coming. I can see a few of you still writing. Brilliant. And Kristina, thank you for responding to that question in the chat. There's a little bit more there about contract management in there. Workshops and pilots, one-to-one discussions, so kind of doing the kind of one-to-one approach, having the kind of relational focus. Analysis of scope 3 carbon emissions via spend analysis to identify where suppliers can have the most impact. So again, using data to help prioritize where you're focusing. Piloting a sustainability impact assessment. Brilliant, would love to hear more about that, and using that, the outcome of that to guide the 10% social value. Giving examples, case studies, brilliant. Yeah, examples of other suppliers and what they do, and regularly reviewing their progress. Keep going. We're going to keep this up for another couple of minutes so we can capture as much as we can about what you're doing. And yeah, keep typing. Once we do move on to the next question, you will still be able to keep typing in there. Brilliant. Lots of you sharing your activities in there. And Kristina, I don't know if you saw, but I think there was another question in there for you around prioritizing. Are you prioritizing getting supplier reported emissions for contracts where it's assumed scope 3 is embodied in the supplier's scope 1 and 2? So I wonder if you feel you can have a go at that while we capture the last few on here. So yeah, interesting. Lots more on specifications and tenders. Great. Giving examples, mini sustainability impact assessments. Great. Keep going. If you're typing in there and still sharing, keep going. We're going to move the question on, and you'll be able to come to this once you've already submitted for the last one, which is, what else would you love to try? So we're really keen to hear, what is it you're thinking about doing, but you perhaps haven't done yet? What are the things that you're considering? Where do you see yourself going next on this journey? What does the next step look like? What would you love to try or test? Maybe what have you seen others doing that you're keen to adapt or try locally? Again, I'll give you a few minutes to have a think and respond to that. And then we're going to move on and hear a little bit from Alex. Brilliant. So we've got some of the engagement events people are trying, measurement tools to realistically count the carbon savings. Great. And again, I'm sure many people on this call will have done different types of engagement with suppliers, some in events, some in some of those one-to-one conversations. So if that's you and you feel like you've had some engagement events that have worked really well, please do share in the chat. We can try and bring you off mute later to tell us a little bit more about it. Building in considerations from the start and the contract management piece, so people keen to start focusing on that. Getting established procurement professionals on board and talking about sustainability with suppliers, carbon literacy work for suppliers. Great. NHS Scotland contracts needing to change to a more equal distribution of questions. Yeah, so all of this is, what are the things you'd love to try? What's next on your kind of list of things that you think will push you forward on this journey? More case studies to show the difference being made. Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder actually if some of the people on this call have got case studies they can share. If you have, let us know. Again, pop your name in the chat, or you can direct message the @Halm UK account, and we can try and collate and signpost to some of those in the learning outputs from this, because many of you, I'm sure, will have examples and case studies, some of which might be written up. Yeah, awareness raising or training with SMEs, thinking about developing a sustainable procurement charter policy. Fantastic. Brilliant. Okay, keep going. I'm going to hold that up just for one more minute, and then we're going to come to Alex and hear a little bit from the NHS England perspective and all the brilliant work and resources that Alex's team have been producing. And Kristina, thank you for coming back on that question there. So you've started ranking the suppliers by proxy spend emissions, and then going down the list and deciding whether to keep them in based on your leverage and impact. And leverage is a really important point, actually, which maybe we'll come back to later, like how you have, as a local authority or a trust or another kind of body, assessed that leverage. What's been the way in which you've who have you had those discussions with? How have you assessed it? Fab, couple more coming in. Providers of a system for suppliers like Avani, looking for evidence of additionality, working with a CO2 company to measure the carbon footprint of suppliers. Brilliant. So some really interesting stuff people are working on. Keep going. We're going to be sharing out some of those examples from the Slido in the outputs from today. So it would be brilliant to get as many of your examples as possible. And I'm going to suggest that we move now to hearing from Alex. So welcome, Alex. I know you and your team have got some really brilliant resources that people may or may not be aware of, and you've got some super helpful learning to share. So I'm going to hand over to you. And again, I'll give you a shout on the 8-minute point, if that's okay, and let you know you've got a couple of minutes left, and then we're going to go out to some Q&A.
Tremendous. Thanks so much. And it's great to see so many people here today. It's been super inspiring already, actually. It's great to hear that it's not just us that's working on this. I'm joined today by members of my team as well, present and past, on the call. So that's good. I've got some backup if I've got some specific technical questions. So yes, thank you so much. I've got a few things to talk about. I mean, it's been interesting. I've got presentation I want to go through, but I'm really looking forward to the Q&A, because I think that's where we're going to get into the really interesting stuff. I can tell you a bit about what we're doing, and then we can get into the details. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So this is our net zero supplier roadmap. If you're familiar with the NHS sustainability program and the Greener NHS, you will have seen this. These it feels like a really sort of standard thing now that we have this, but this is actually a pretty groundbreaking policy establishment. We agreed this in September 2021 with the NHS England board, and it essentially puts a roadmap of milestones in place for our suppliers to join us on our net zero journey. And so it's a sort of minimum expectations that we our suppliers need to adhere to, and when. So 2 of those milestones are currently have passed, and we're currently working on them. So from April 2022, we launched the social value model. So that's the minimum 10% weighting on net zero and social value in every procurement, and that's a 10% of the total criteria. So it's not just 10% of quality, it's 10% of the total 100%. And we're sort of a year and a bit into that, so I can give you some reflections. And then also from April of this year, so last month, we now require our suppliers of our largest contracts to have a carbon reduction plan. And from next year, we'll be expanding that requirement to even more procurements. You'll notice as well, from 2027, we're really going to start to kind of up the accelerate the progress and the expectation. We're going to be asking our suppliers for the scope 3 emissions that are the really kind of tricky bit around their the impact of their products and services. And from 2028, we're going to ask our suppliers to give us the carbon impact of what they are providing to us. So we want to know product and service carbon footprint, as well as their scope 3 emissions. So exciting times. And I will tell you a little bit more about what we're doing specifically on social value. So we've been doing a ton, and I'm really glad to say, we've had we in NHS England, one thing I should say about the NHS is that we buy over £30 billion worth of things and services every single year. About £15 billion of that is bought by NHS England itself. So we have a significant purchasing team within NHS England, within our commercial directorate, which is where my team and I sit. So we have a kind of a group of procurement professionals that work within NHS England, buying things on a national scale, and then we also have trust-wide and ICB, integrated care board procurement, happening at a regional and a local level. So there's a lot of stakeholders in the room when it comes to our procurement policies, and that's really something that's been a significant part of our program and trying to make sure that we get the word out. We've been doing lots of stuff. We created some fantastic guidance with some of you on the call today. I've seen some familiar faces and names on the call. So, we created some guidance on really health-related outcomes and social value, and that was published in March 2022. And at the moment, we're actually in the process of maturing that guidance and maturing our approach to make sure that we're getting the most out of the social value tendering questions that we're putting into our procurements. We have an e-learning program. We've got fantastic one-to-one support. I myself have sat on some of our larger procurements happening within NHS England. And my former colleague, Al Clay, who's on the call, was on the panel and the evaluation panel for the case study that I'll talk about in just a moment. So fantastic things happening. Certainly more to do to get our program really embedded and delivering the meaningful social value that we're after. Next slide, please. So wanted to just draw attention to this, and actually this is probably something that's worthwhile Googling or looking on the slides when I share them, when they're shared a little bit later. But one of the things that we're really keen to do within the social value work that we're doing is make sure that we're connecting our the procurement and the relationship with our suppliers with the actual needs of the people within our communities and within our healthcare system. So it's all very well if we get some nice, pretty pictures on the wall or things, but it needs to have a real significant value and for our patients. And so we did a really great piece of work with the Healthcare Inequalities team and Hammond about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, around some of the sort of key things to do and key things to think about in terms of health when looking at social value. So apologies for the small text on the screen, but this is, I think, a really useful kind of prompt in terms of thinking about some of the areas that you can think about. So it's things like digital inclusion. It's stuff like making sure that corporate social responsibility is meaningful, and making sure that they're looking at fair recruitment practices. These kinds of things that don't always necessarily come to mind when you start to think about sustainability. So it's a really useful resource. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk briefly through a quick case study. I mean, this is an incredible piece of work that was done. We had a very large procurement for a software platform, essentially, and support the integrated single financial environment, helpfully called ISFE, which doesn't roll off the tongue, and nobody actually knows what it stands for. So you do now. It stands for Integrated Single Financial Environment. And basically, this was a tender for a significant piece of software service that would do our financial management across NHS England and the wider NHS. And we got involved in this quite early. I think that was a really important thing. So we were able to look at some of the opportunities for social value within this tendering process early on and get them into the tender and the specification early. We've had some great outcomes from this procurement. So we asked 3 questions on the themes of fighting climate change, equal opportunity, and tackling economic inequality. And I can go into more detail, but essentially we got some really specific commitments from the successful supplier. And that's really critical, because I think one of the things Kristina was talking about earlier is that it's really important to get something you can measure and something you can come back to from suppliers when they make these commitments. It's all very well if they give you a nice glossy CSR policy, but it doesn't actually provide you anything to hold them to account on. And so I think what was really good about this is that we got some really specific things that we can go back to them and say, you said you do this by this date, how are you doing, and then hold them to account. We are shortlisted actually for the GO Awards. I'm sure you all heard of the GO Awards. I don't think I had, but the Procurement Awards, and they're actually tomorrow. So I will report back as to whether or not we're successful in winning this award. But it's great to be recognized, because I think, there's a lot that we're doing to try to make sure that we get that meaningful social value. So next slide, please.
And there's just a couple of minutes left, but I think probably you are well within. Yeah,
should be okay. Yeah. So I mentioned before that what we're doing at the moment is working on maturing our approach to social value, and this is a natural process. 1 year into our program, we're reflecting on what we've done well, what we can do better, how we can support our colleagues across the NHS to do more meaningful social value within the procurement process. So we're actually working on a kind of an engagement program at the moment with industry, so working with our suppliers, and as well as our NHS colleagues, trade associations, NHS supply chain, who are a really important stakeholder for us, because of course a lot of the stuff we buy in the NHS goes through NHS supply chain. We've just kicked this off last week, a couple weeks ago. So it's an exciting time right now, sort of looking at what we can do to really be specific about delivering social value. And some of that is giving people more specific stuff to ask. Some of it is looking at a local level and understanding what are the key priorities. The sustainability impact assessment that somebody mentioned in the Slido is an interesting one, because what we need people to be doing is thinking about what is it that actually their procurement has the potential to deliver, what's actually relevant to the procurement, and how can it answer a need within the community that's actually there? How can we link up those two things, the need and then the procurement, the scope of that procurement? So that's an ongoing process and project, and we're really excited about it. So that will be finalizing over the summer. couple more slides. I think I just wanted to mention one thing. Yes, I think it's my last slide, other than thank you very much, which is that next week, actually, we are launching our Evergreen Sustainable Supplier Assessment. And this is really exciting because what this is a single place where our suppliers to the NHS, any supplier to the NHS can, or even a prospective supplier to the NHS, can provide information about what they're doing against the net zero and sustainability agenda of the NHS. And this is really important because one of the things we are very conscious of in the NHS is we have a lot of suppliers. We also have a lot of procurement teams. And if we have procurement teams, each procurement team asking our suppliers for the same information, it becomes very, very burdensome upon the supplier to provide that information. And actually it sort of defeats the purpose of what we're trying to achieve. So we've created Evergreen. It is really fantastic. My team has developed it. I'm so proud of it. And it sits within our procurement portal, which is called Adamus. So it's sort of integrated into the system. So as a supplier who goes on there and does the assessment, they'll get a level 1, 2, 3, or 4 being the highest. And then that sits in their supplier record. So any supplier, anybody going to that into Adamus to see the supplier record can see where the supplier is on that journey. And they don't have to do it every single time they do a procurement. It's every year. So it's a really exciting initiative that we're launching at NHS Confed next Wednesday. So if you're in and around Manchester on Wednesday, come and see us. We'll be launching it there. So I think I just have one last slide, which is contact details and links, and to say thank you so much for your time and attention.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alex. Really brilliant hearing about that. And good luck with the awards tomorrow. We're going to have to eagerly await the result. Some really useful links there. As we said, the slides are going to be emailed out, as will the recording. So you'll have access to that. And I'm going to invite Kristina and Alex back on screen. We're going to do some Q&A now. There are a few questions coming into the chat. Take a minute, have a think. Is there anything else you'd love to ask the speakers or put out to the rest of the group? You know, there's 80 odd people on the call at the moment, most of whom work directly in procurement and or sustainability. So lots of people here who might potentially have examples if you're looking for those. But Alex, I wonder first, Kristina, I'll come to you in a moment, but Alex, initially, any thoughts on a couple of those questions that have come through in the chat?
So I'm just having a quick skim of them. So one question around offsetting. So our position on offsetting is that it's really a last resort. So we're asking suppliers to have a look at what they can be doing to actually reduce their own emissions and the impact of their operations and their supply chain first before they look at offsetting. So at the moment, we don't have an official sort of threshold as to what we accept, but it's certainly not 100%. And we tend to align to the SBTI standards on the way that we measure and offset and look at offsetting. And then the other one was around, do NHS trusts need to complete assessments on Evergreen? And the answer is no. It's for suppliers. If NHS trusts are bidding for work as sort of commission services, they can do that through their green plan. They can sort of use their green plans to demonstrate their work.
Thank you, Alex. And there's more coming in through the chat, so we're going to filter them as they come in. But I wanted to come back to one of the questions, Kristina, that you kind of touched on in your presentation and which came out a little bit through the Slido, which was this idea of like leverage and how you assess where you think you have the most leverage or influence as a local authority or a trust. What were the I'm curious to hear a little bit more, like what were the conversations you had internally? What are some of the things that helped you work out whether or not you felt you would have enough leverage to make it worthwhile? I'd love to hear a little bit more about the story behind that.
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. I think part of it, we piggybacked off of the leverage, or the way the city already kind of like ranks their contracts. So they're kind of done by like an ABC based on how much spend goes through, how important that service is to the corporation, like how much hand-holding they might need, and they're going to get ranked into these different boxes. So we took a similar sort of approach to it from a climate side as well, but also overlaying how many emissions the proxy kind of bit kicked out and told us they were having. So do we have a lot of spend with them? But in the grand scheme of things, is that spend like a drop in the ocean for the supplier, or are we quite significant? So actually quite a few of the suppliers we're working with are on the small to medium side, because we're obviously kind of more important to them than maybe a large multinational, particularly like a software service where they're providing like a license and we're basically they're the intermediary to us. So we've got a few of those suppliers and they're like really engaged, because obviously for them it's semi-advantageous for them to work with us, because we're trying to give them a lot of support to get through this process, which will then help them in other businesses. But for some of those larger ones, it's been quite interesting when we've been speaking to the suppliers, they've almost like starting to expect this question to come forward. So once you get the account manager is kind of unsure, so they bring in their sustainability person, and then they're like, oh yeah, we've had this question before from other suppliers, like here's what we've told them, sort of thing. So it does seem to be something that is increasing. But I guess just going back to that initial leverage point, it is a little bit manual at the moment. So is going through like, how much spend do we have with them? What is the service? Do we think that service does have much to do for climate? So some of the ones we're incorporating at the moment are where we've got quite a lot of spend going through, because there's a lot of spend going through, the carbon emissions are showing as quite high, but actually we don't believe it should be. Like for fuel cards and stuff, okay, they're purchasing fuel, so it's showing as quite carbon intensive, but actually for our point of view, it's just like the money going through. So that's just a software piece. So we're hoping that by working with them there, we can get quite a big reduction, but just by, again, improving the data quality. So it's not really a quick answer, but it is just a case of like going down the list initially based on kind of that spend-based proxy bit and overlaying the other information you have and kind of making a judgment call. So I'm afraid not necessarily the most scientific, but
no, doesn't have to be. And I think I'm gonna, maybe if we have time, come back to you on the SME point as well, because I know there were some reflections in the Slido around supplier engagement, and we've done some work with anchors in Hammond around supplier engagement, and I think there is some interesting learning, and hopefully maybe perhaps you have some to share too around like what has worked with supplier engagement, particularly around SMEs. Alex, there's a couple of other questions in the chat. I wonder if there's any that you want to speak to in particular. I'm just catching up on them too.
Yeah, there's one from Sarah at LPP around the use of the social value portal tool, which I'm aware of, and the team at LPP is part of our Sustainable Procurement Forum, and Michelle's a pal. We've got, so I suppose we are conscious of this too. We've looked at one of the things we're trying to do more widely across commercial within the NHS, not simply on sustainability, is improve access to suppliers, particularly our SMEs, but make the process of working with us easier. And so we are conscious that if we use a system like the social value portal, where suppliers have to submit their answers on the social value questions in a separate format, in a separate system, it can be kind of it can feel duplicative and a little bit difficult. What we're hoping to do, just with Evergreen, we are covering suppliers' corporate position on sustainability, and this is an important distinction because it's not necessarily going to be, it wouldn't be where they would submit their information on a specific tender in relation to a question that had been asked as part of that tender. It would be a more general question about their corporate position on net zero, modern slavery, and other sustainability areas. So I think one of the big questions that we're seeking to understand is, what is the best way of getting the right information out of our suppliers in the best, sort of most efficient way possible. One thing I will say is, I recently, this is not rocket science, but it's a really simple solution. I recently took part in an evaluation of an absolutely gigantic tender in terms of value and scale. And one of the things that we asked suppliers to do, which isn't onerous, is to provide a timed action plan for what they will deliver as part of the social value requirement. And the questions were specific enough that there was a clear steer for them to come up with a number of sort of specific things and to tell us when those things would be delivered. And that timed action plan was really, really helpful. And I think will be very helpful for the successful supplier to be then agreed and then included in the contract. So it sits there. You don't have to go back to the tender documentation to see what was agreed as part of the social value. It sits within the contract. And I think that's an area where it sounds really quite straightforward and simple, and it is, but actually it gives us a really specific and concrete way of keeping track of what we've agreed with our suppliers. And I think that for us is an area that I think has potential to continue.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we're doing something similar now. So we've got, I think, possibly a similar sort of social value menu, which, you know, at tender stage, the supplier has to say, we're going to do X in X year and this in year 2, and they have to get to a certain number of points in order to like pass. And then the second part of the question is explaining exactly how they're going to do that and evidencing it. But we're also starting to ask suppliers to kind of like make a sustainable action plan almost. So it's literally asking them, tell us what you put in your tender and put it in a document that we can attach into the contract, so that we kind of start jumping over this gap of the sales team bid for the world. A completely new contract team comes in, and then no one looks back at the document until someone like me comes along and like reads through it. So we're trying really hard now at the beginning of as soon as the tender goes live, like during that mobilization phase, being like, right, you go through and tell us what you committed to, put it in a document, and on like at least an annual basis, we'll cross-check it and see where you're at. And it's not to say like, you know, if you haven't done it, you know, all hell's going to break loose, but it's just so that everyone's on the same page with the level of expectation, so that if they have committed to like 30 things and then that's not achievable in year 1, at least you can start to like potentially space them out, or like have a conversation early instead of getting to the end of the year or the end of the contract and being like, well, you promised us 30 things, did you do any of it? So we're trying a lot harder now to capture these things in the mobilization stage, so that everyone's working off of the same sheet, and again showing that it's important to the supplier as well. It wasn't just like a tick box exercise to get through the door. Now you're in the door, it's still important to us, sort of thing.
Absolutely, and really helpful, Kristina. And I think, as you said a moment ago, Alex, this isn't necessarily rocket science, and you said, Kristina, and it's not, you know, the most advanced, but actually a lot of this is about small incremental steps. It's actually what we've talked about a lot today is kind of almost a lot of the human side of it. You know, there's a very technical component and side to this, but there's also kind of, how do you support people to learn? And there's a question I'm going to come to, I think probably our last question, which is around, you know, what are the things we know about the best way to help the workforce factor, you know, develop the skills and the confidence and the know-how around this? What are the ways in which we have learned that we can help others learn and embed this work? You know, it's conversation by conversation. It's a bit of data analysis. Sometimes it's you know, creating a couple of spreadsheets and, you know, doing some rough and ready stuff. It doesn't have to be rocket science. It is just the kind of carving out that time and intentionality to think it through. And it's in some cases, you know, thinking it through for the first time. And that's what we're hearing a little bit about on the call. There's a couple of other questions in the chat which might be worth coming to. There's one for you, Kristina, around how you decided to use Avani. Did you look at other models? And also there was one a bit further back on the governance process you had to go through to change the value, the 15% weighting. You might want to pop into the chat and just respond to those. We've only got a few minutes left. We did want to give people the chance to come and share any of their own learning or practice. So I know it's a big ask when you're in listening and learning mode, but if anybody did feel they had anything they wanted to share, feel free to pop your hand up and come off mute. We've got a few minutes left in case you feel there's any of those questions that you can speak to, or anything else you've been doing locally that you've tried that's worked really well, or that you've tried and it was a disaster and you think, just don't do that, or we'll do it differently next time. So I'll give you a moment to see if you fancy coming in, and if not, I will in a moment hand back over to Alex and Kristina, who hopefully will have had a chance to look through some of those final questions just for their last thoughts before we wrap up the session? Okay. Let's do final closing thoughts, and you may want to come back through any of those other questions we haven't talked about yet. Kristina first, and then I'll come to you, Alex. And maybe actually the one, if you did have any thoughts, I'd love to hear more. I think there's that question from Michael around what in your view is the best learning approach in helping the workforce and specifically employees in procurement to factor sustainability into their practice. So yeah, Kristina, any thoughts from you?
I think it's probably just like repetition, like in a weird, like I'm kind of fortunate that at the city there is my position that exists, and me and my manager Lisa, who does the full responsible management of procurement side, just pipe up in like every meeting we're in, to the point where people then start anticipating the fact that you're going to ask the question, so we'll then respond to it before you've asked it. So by talking about it almost until you feel like you're blue in the face, like eventually it will sink in and people will start to get it. So now it's actually, we're in quite a nice place where people will mention it before we do, so they're aware, and it's starting to get through that kind of that process. And that's where we hope our low carbon procurement document is going to really help, because we're hoping it's going to be interactive, so it won't just be like a boring document for them to read through. We've tried really hard to make it engaging, and so they can go to the bit that they're interested in at that particular time, so they don't have to like read through it and then try and remember that it was on page 20, the bit that was interested to. They could just jump to page 20. But I think having that presence in meetings, like it's hard to get through the door in some meetings, like there's contract managers that I still haven't managed to get in front of, but the ones that I have, getting that position to be like a standing agenda item has been really helpful, to the point where I don't need to be on the meetings anymore because it's become the standard agenda item. But it does take time to get to that. And from like a procurement team, like we've had some whole team meetings where like I've spoken for 5 minutes and we've given them kind of the resources, and like they come to us initially to ask questions or support, but eventually we'll take all these questions and turn them into a document that they can then like read through themselves. So I think it is, a little bit of hand holding initially, but once you get through that bit, I think they'll have the knowledge. But you do I think there isn't really a quick fix. I don't think you can jump the hand holding, and I think people appreciate it as well when you do kind of turn up, because obviously everybody is busy.
Thank you, Kristina. And there's again a couple more last minute questions that have come through in the chat, if you have any thoughts on those. Alex, last minute from you, and then we're going to run a quick slide on next steps, other resources and so on before we close out.
Cool, thanks. And Lynn, I'm going to try to respond to your question in the chat. I think we have made a bit of we've tried to be too nice to people, if I'm honest, and give them too much information and hold their hands through too much, and be, provide everything we possibly can. And we still will try to do that. But one thing that I have noticed is a bit of feedback and accountability really helps. So we have a procurement system that shows who the contract owner is, and whether or not they included a social value question. And so we can provide them with, hey, 60% of the tenders you put out in the last 4 months didn't have a social value question. Why is that? And go back to them and ask those questions. And I think when people, I if anyone knows me on the call, they know I'm not particularly a punitive type person. It's not the approach I tend to like to take, but actually providing that feedback and accountability has actually been quite an effective way of doing things. So yes, all the resources, yes, this, as much engagement and support as possible, but also a bit of, hey, we're actually looking, we're watching, we're making sure this is getting done properly. And that coming from not just my team and me, but also from commercial managers and leaders across the organizations, I think really helps. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Alex. We are just going to show you one final slide and share a quick poll on your experience of the event. Really helpful for us to get some feedback on what you found helpful. So we're just going to launch this poll now. Thank you. If you could score that for us while I talk through what next, that would be really helpful. As I said, the recording and the slides will be coming back out to you at some point shortly, certainly before the end of the week. You can sign up to our newsletter. You can also download resources and read blogs at hound.org.uk. And there is the conversation happening online on Twitter with the hashtag health anchors, and we run lots of events. We've got a couple that we're planning for later in the year, so keep your eye out for those. And it was great to have you, Alex and Kristina. Thank you so much. It was brilliant to have your perspectives. So much we've been capturing, and we're going to be trying to create a kind of learning output from this that does your contributions justice. And I know that everybody, I'm already seeing some of the results from the poll, really, really useful. Huge number of people have said they found that really helpful, which is great. I think just the right level of detail and lots of practice shared, which is fab. Thank you so much, everyone. It's 1 o'clock now. There's a final point in the chat there about how you sign up to the newsletter. Great to have you here. Hope it's given you some ideas and food for thought to take back out into your teams across the UK. And we look forward to seeing you at one of our events very shortly. Once again, thank you so much, Kristina. Thank you, Alex. Fantastic to have you both here sharing your experience. And we will see you all soon. Thank you so much, everyone.